Let's talk about Robert Kennedy Jr. now, since he's made the controversial move recently of meeting with his father's alleged murderer, Sirhan Sirhan, in prison. Surprisingly, outlets like the Washington Post covered this. I remember reading it at the time, giving it a fair shake, and RFK Jr.'s statements about it. And he actually believes that Sirhan Sirhan was not solely responsible, or maybe not at all involved in his father's assassination. Using this as a starting point, can you give us the backstory to what led up to that assassination, and also just like the time frame between RFK and JFK's assassination?
Right. Well, Kennedy gets assassinated in November of '63. RFK resigns during for LBJ's second term as Attorney General, and he runs to be a senator in New York. I believe in '64 he gets elected. I don't think it's '66. I think it's '64. And so he's a senator in New York, and he campaigns on this anti-poverty platform. And eventually he turns against the Vietnam War, and he is persuaded to enter the race after Johnson's poor performances early on. So Johnson has struggles against McCarthy, decides to drop out, and then RFK enters the race. Now, at the same time, you have Martin Luther King, who is come out against the Vietnam War, and he's not just speaking about civil rights. He's linking everything together: the great evils of the American empire, militarism, racism, and economic exploitation or poverty. And so, in 1968, you have it's famous for being this summer of protests all over the world, like Mexico City, Paris, all these places where you have these movements against the establishment. And the establishment, I think, was really terrified in the summer of '68. Louis Lapham, who used to be the editor of Harper's, and his brother was he came from an oil family, and I think his brother worked for the CIA. But Lapham described being at the Bohemian Grove in 1968, and that among the people that were there, all of these political economic elites, they're all hanging out at the Bohemian Grove doing whatever weird stuff they do. But in '68 there was just this sort of mood of terror and fear about all of these social forces that were kind of mobilizing against the status quo. And I think that's probably related to what happens in 1968. You have MLK announces he wants this poor people's campaign, and his plan is to do what the Bonus Army did, to go out to Washington and camp out there until they stop spending billions on the war and start spending money to help poor people at home. And it was not it wasn't poor black people, it was all poor people: poor white people, poor Hispanic people, poor black people as well. So any poor people. And his family, King's family, thinks that that's why he was murdered, that campaign was a real threat. And one day King gets a call from Robert Kennedy, and Robert Kennedy says, go do it, go camp out in Washington. So at that point, in the early months of 1968, you've got a guy running for president who really represents the most progressive part of the establishment, because the Kennedys are obviously part of the establishment. And you have a social movement that's mobilized behind a leader, Martin Luther King. And, if you had these sort of radical parts of society and the people who with the machinery of the state on the same page, well, you really had a shift in American politics. But on April 4th, Martin Luther King gets assassinated. And then a couple of months later, almost 2 months exactly, RFK gets assassinated. And that assassination is very, both of them are, have been, in neither case did the assassin say, oh yeah, I did it, and for this reason. Like in the King case, the alleged assassin was convicted because he said he was told he'd be given the death penalty if he didn't. He later says, I didn't do it, and they've never really had a good motive for why he would have done it. And then in the case of RFK, Sirhan Sirhan has always said he doesn't remember doing it, even though there's lots of witnesses that show him that had him shooting, at Kennedy. But the thing about the Robert Kennedy assassination is that the autopsy, in conjunction with the eyewitnesses, basically exonerates Sirhan from being the killer, because the shot that killed Robert Kennedy was fired at just about point blank range in the back of his head. and all the witnesses have Sirhan like 6 feet, in front of him. And so it doesn't appear that Sirhan could have really done that. It appears what happened is he stands there, shouts something, starts shooting, and then someone standing behind Kennedy shoots him in the back of the head.
And so other than the idea that the actual fatal headshot was done by someone else, what are some other key facts that you think are important that dispute what we understand as the official narrative? And additionally, is there someone who has been accused of, or researchers or investigative reporters have determined might have been that person who shot Robert F. Kennedy in the head?
Yeah, people have looked into this for a long time. So the first books start coming out in the 1970s. There's a lot of weird evidence in this case. For example, there's too many bullet holes. They find more bullet holes than Sirhan's gun held. So that suggests, more shooters, additional shooters, at least one additional shooter, maybe more.
And there's been forensic investigators who have actually looked at this, right? It's not just journalists.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. There's photographs of what appear to be bullet holes, and they took these and they saved the door frames and the ceiling tiles, and they're supposed to keep these as evidence, but they ended up losing them. There's actually a recurring pattern in all of these cases of evidence missing. John Kennedy's brain is missing. They lost it, which could show, which direction bullets came from, for example. You have autopsy photographs of John Kennedy where the guy who supposedly took them categorically denies having taken them, saying, I never used that kind of photography paper, and I don't remember taking these at all. You have the bullet that was taken from RFK's neck that vanishes. There was a young boy who started taking pictures right when the shooting happened at the Ambassador Hotel when RFK was killed. He stands up on a table and starts taking pictures. Well, the police take his camera. He never gets those pictures back. He takes them to court. He wins a lawsuit, and they agree that they're supposed to pay him damages and give him the photographs. And then when the photographs are to be returned to them, the police claim that they stopped somewhere and that the photographs got stolen.
Wow. And there's actual video recordings of before and after the assassination, right?
There's actually, for the RFK case, there's audio recording that surfaced in recent years, and they were taken to an acoustic an analyst. I think his name is Philip von Prague, and he shows what should be 11 shots or something like that. So this got written up in CNN a few years ago. You can, Google CNN RFK acoustic analysis or something, and you can find those stories. So there was, there's a lot of evidence. They've tried to get Sirhan an appeal, and the most recent attempt had people even RFK Jr. saying, please, give him his parole or give him another hearing. And I believe the last person to have the authority to be able to do so ignored all of the evidence that Sirhan's side had mustered and refused to grant, another hearing, saying that, well, even if Sirhan didn't shoot the actual shot that killed him, he was involved, so he couldn't be exonerated. And that person was Kamala Harris.
Oh,
and
fascinating.
she goes on to be a senator, and she goes on to sit on the Intelligence Committee. So, I guess
she did her duty to get in there.
I mean, I don't know if it's exactly tit for tat or quid pro quo, but it seems really there's a certain symmetry there.
There's also a similar. There's also a similar
what?
figure who comes out during the MLK case that we'll talk about in a little bit. Who's not a politician, but he's a journalist named Gerald Posner. I don't know if you know anything about him, but
oh yeah, he's the guy that wrote. Well, he's sort of he seems like the CIA's little scribe or something. He wrote a book sort of responding to Oliver Stone's movie, and then he also wrote a book about the MLK assassination as well. So he defends official stories. He's been discredited in recent years as a plagiarist.
Oh, that's shocking. Yeah, there's a lot of interesting players who have been involved, and even Philip Zelikow, who you're probably aware of, was responsible for manipulating the JFK tapes that happened during the Cuban Missile Crisis to make JFK appear more hawkish.
Oh, right. Yeah, he did those with like Ernest May. He co-authored the book on the Cuban Missile Crisis tapes, and he edited them in badly, so much so that one of the people who worked at the Kennedy Library, wrote a review saying how bad it was.
Yeah, I mean, purposeful manipulation of the historical record. I mean, it's interesting how many of these people crop up throughout these different things. And of course, Philip Zelikow infamously was in charge of the 9/11 Commission and wrote the conclusions to it before the commission even started. So
yeah, didn't staff members make like a satirical outline of that where they actually compare it to the Warren Commission and the Magic Bullet and other things like that? I seem to recall a story like that.
That sounds familiar, but I don't know the details of that. But in regards to Sirhan, I mean, just go into a little bit who he was, what was his country of origin. There was something about him being just released from the hospital previously to this assassination, and then also this idea of how valid is it, because it seems like the prevailing narrative that kind of took up the most space in sort of these conspiracy, narratives or writings is that he was some kind of Manchurian candidate who was brainwashed to be an assassin.
Yeah, well, Sirhan is a very interesting, tragic figure. He was Palestinian and had come over, I think, a few years prior to this, and he didn't have a great job, but he had, among other things he did, he rode horses for a living at this ranch. And at some point he has a fall from a horse, and which really should have been like a visit to the hospital, and then that was it. It wasn't that serious, but when they've looked into his records, and he's gone for like a fairly long time, and there's not documentation saying exactly where he is. So he seems to have fallen off the grid, and his family can't account for it either when they've been asked about it. And so people have always tried to figure out what his role was, because he's in a really weird state after the assassination, and the way he responds to questioning is very strange. He won't give his name up, but he doesn't seem to even know what he's being charged with, and etc. And so what a lot of people that have looked into it have concluded is that he seems to have been like hypnotized to try to just pull out a gun and shoot at Robert Kennedy. And this is probably it is the most problematic part of the whole case, is that it sounds too strange to be true to somebody who's just hearing about this. But, the CIA did carry on these projects, like these mind control projects. There was the Project Artichoke, which was done to try to create mind control assassins. There's documentation of a CIA officer who hypnoprogrammed his secretary, basically hypnotized her into picking up a gun. It wasn't loaded, but she didn't know that. Picking up a gun and shooting her colleague, which doesn't shoot them because it's not loaded, but she picks up the gun and actually tries to kill her. So that was what this CIA officer had done, I guess probably without the consent of this person, just like, hypnotized her and done this. So they did put energy into doing this. It looks like what makes sense in terms of being in accordance with the evidence is that Sirhan was hypnotized more to be like a distraction while somebody else fired the shots. Lisa Pease, who's written the best book on this subject, it just came out recently, called A Lie Too Big to Fail, and she believes that he was probably firing blanks and that there were other shooters. I really, in terms of getting into all the details on these forensic issues, like I'm not an expert on that, but at any rate, Sirhan seems to have been programmed one way or the other, whether he was shooting real bullets or not. When people went back to hypnotize him, they found him extremely easy to hypnotize. There's a guy named Dan Brown who was a Harvard psychologist and an expert on hypnosis, and he's testified on behalf of Sirhan and been interviewed for these different documentaries talking about it that people have tried to make to look into the case. And he says Sirhan's extremely easy to hypnotize, and you can send him under very easily, and you can get him to do whatever. Years ago, they hypnotized him, and they tell him to start, acting like a monkey. And so he turns around and starts like trying to climb up the bars of his cage. So the numerous people who've examined Sirhan say he seems really easy to hypnotize. And so that's the angle of the case that, you know, is a bit divisive because it seems so crazy. But, you know, the other alternative is that he was in on some sort of plot and that other people shot him. Now, the people that the Washington Post and Lisa Pease, the Washington Post wrote a review of Lisa's book, and Lisa fingers Mayhew as the guy who was likely, who's a likely suspect in the case. Robert Mayhew?
Robert Mayhew
was really
yeah.
he was like a bag man for Howard Hughes, and he did jobs for the CIA. He's the guy that inspired Mission Impossible. You know, because if you watch Mission Impossible, they're doing things that are like too sensitive for the other agencies, you know, and it's always, you know, something kind of cool or involving high technology in the films and the TV show, but like in real life, it was just something that was so gangsterish that the CIA would prefer to like outsource it in a way. So, like for example, he was the person who approached the mafia in order to try to get the mafia involved in the assassination plots against Castro. And the guy that was standing behind Robert Kennedy and who was holding Kennedy's tie when Kennedy fell down was a guy named Thane Eugene Caesar. And he was a security guard for Ace Security, which I believe was like a Mayhew company and somehow affiliated with Lockheed Martin as well, you know, a big military industrial complex firm. And this guy Thane Eugene Caesar was seen by multiple witnesses with his gun drawn behind Robert Kennedy. So he if there was somebody who had to be like identified as the suspect who actually would have killed Robert Kennedy, he seems like the most obvious one. But you know, it's not like something that has been proven at this point. But there's a lot of reasons, witness testimony, and etc. to think that he was, and strange connections to Mayhew as well. And personal associates of Mayhew also said that they believed or even knew that he was involved with the Robert Kennedy assassination.